All right, we're back into the Charles Stanley Life Principles Daily Bible, where we read a little bit from the Old Testament, Psalm, Proverb, and New Testament every single day throughout the year. By the end of the year, we'll make it through the whole Bible. So today, we're going through the end of Abraham's story, and now it's passing off to Isaac and then eventually Jacob and Esau. Not going to say that name right this entire conversation, but that's all right. Then we got our Psalm and Proverb. I kind of forget what they were. I read them early this morning. And then Matthew, we have some great ones. Seems like I say that every day about Matthew, but that's the story of Jesus, greatest story ever told. So we'll get into Genesis 25, where in the previous chapter, remember Sarah died. So in this one, I don't know if it was in the previous chapter Sarah died. Might have been 2 chapters ago. And then Abraham did that like real estate deal to get a good tomb for her. And then the previous chapter, I believe, was actually more about Abraham sending a servant to go get a wife for his son Isaac, which means he laughs. It's the son that Abraham and Sarah had in their old age. And now it's time for him to start bringing in those descendants that God promised. So they bring back Rebecca, and the last chapter leaves off with, then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So that ties it up. Now let's start into Genesis 25. So Abraham takes another wife, and then it seems like they have a whole bunch of children together. And Abraham ends up living to 175 years. Then he breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave. I believe it's the same cave that he got the land in that real estate deal for Sarah. And then Isaac settles at Bir Lahai-roi, another name that I'm not going to be saying correctly. So then it goes into the descendants of Ishmael. Ishmael was the son that Abraham had with the servant. And while God's covenant isn't through Ishmael, he did promise he was going to give him 12 princes. And this ends up showing that God fulfilled that promise right there. Ishmael has 12 princes. And then we get into the birth of Esau and Jacob. So when Isaac was 40 years old, he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padoram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean. Just throwing all sorts of difficult names at me today. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife. This is where it's going to get in a little bit more, where I think there's things that we can more draw out of the text. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire to the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger." So she's barren. That seems to be happening a lot throughout this story, where the big promise that God has made to Abraham and his descendants is that they're going to be have offspring, where that if you counted them, it'd be more than the stars in the sky or the dust on the earth. So it's perhaps the thing that they're looking forward to the most, and the thing that they're expecting to get from God the most. And perhaps they're getting a bit impatient. So one of the ways that God puts them in a position where they have to have ultimate faith in God, have trust in God, to be obedient and surrender to God's timing, is maybe by being barren for a little bit. Seems like that was certainly the case with Sarah. Now it seems like the case with Rebekah as well. And it's interesting that God doesn't grant kind of what you'd imagine that both Isaac and Sarah want. Oh, not Isaac and Sarah. That'd be even weirder than some of the other stuff we've read so far. Thinking about a lot. Isaac and Rebekah. Seems that the Lord was maybe waiting for Isaac to pray to the Lord. Shows obedience, surrender, saying, "God, we know that when this comes, it's going to be from you." So, just praying. and then he grants them that prayer. So that's not to say that everything you pray for you're going to get, but it is to say that sometimes God can push off that timing until we're ready for it. And that's what I get from reading this, is that I finally got to the point where Isaac was ready in God's eyes. So when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so they called him Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with a hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. And Jacob, let's see, go to the note 426. Jacob means he takes by the heel or he cheats. So that's kind of interesting. And so his name was Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. All right, so it seems like a pretty straightforward story at this point. Rebekah's barren. Isaac prays to God. She has two sons. They're fighting in the womb, maybe a little precursor to what's going to be happening later. Esau's the firstborn. He's all hairy and red. Jacob comes afterwards holding his heel. His name also means he cheats. That might be a little foreshadowing to what's going to come. And Esau is the skillful hunter who Isaac loves. And then sounds like Jacob's more the quiet introvert type, and Rebekah loves him more. It's funny that these parents are picking favorites of who they love more. So this is kind of a famous story coming up next, where it's Esau sells his birthright. So we'll just read the whole thing. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. Edom means red, named after the red stew. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Then Esau despised his birthright. Excuse me. So that idea that he despised his birthright, seems that what it's touching on there is that Esau just maybe isn't all that connected to God. I'll read the note for that one. That's 34. It says, the final evaluation of the verbal tussle and bartering that took place between the twins, all of which was indicative of prior discussions or arguments sufficient for Jacob to conclude how little Esau valued it. He became therefore known as irreligious or unholy. So there's that last part that I thought was interesting, that because he despised his birthright, it's considered irreligious and unholy. And then God makes a promise to Isaac, basically says, "I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." So one thing that I was actually just talking to one of my buddies about is that perhaps this all the nations, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, that's pointing to Jesus. And perhaps the offspring in that case is a singular, where it's through Jesus that all the nations are blessed. It's not just God's chosen people, Israel, but through Jesus, it's opened up even to the Gentiles. So then all the nations are blessed. And then God says, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So I did think that last verse was kind of interesting, especially after everything we read about Abraham. He certainly had his ups and downs, but at the end of the day, God says, you know what? He obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And then, speaking of Abraham and his ups and downs, seems like Isaac has some of the ups and downs as well, and actually in the exact same way that Abraham did. So Isaac settled in Gerar, another name, probably not saying it right. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." Here we go again. For he feared to say, my wife, thinking lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. Reminds me of that old song. If you want to have a happy life, like never make a pretty woman your wife. Maybe that's the lesson that we're supposed to pull out of these verses here. But he's basically making the same mistake that Abraham did, where he went off to Egypt and then he said, oh, Sarah's my sister. And then he ended up getting some wealth out of it, but it wasn't viewed favorably there. And then he actually does it again, and now Isaac's the one doing it. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and I originally was thinking this is the same Abimelech that we were reading about earlier, but the timeline doesn't really make sense there. So maybe that's more a title for a king, or maybe they passed down the name, but it's not the same one. King of the Philistines looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister? Isaac said to him, because I thought lest I die because of her. Same excuse that Abraham had. Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. So then it goes on to Isaac sowing in the land. Seems like he becomes very wealthy. And then he had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. And then Abimelech says to Isaac, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we. So he has so much wealth, and the wealth of this time was in herds, which could eat a lot of the grass. So he says, you know what, get on out of here. And then there's this continued story about Isaac looking for some land and some wells, and it seems like there's some conflict here and there. And yeah, I think he eventually, that same day, Isaac's servants came and told him about the well that they had dug and said to him, we have found water. He called it Sheba, therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. So basically it seems like Isaac is settling. Interesting what my eyes just caught up on here though. Then he goes to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you, and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. And then he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. So that's maybe a good place to end this one, because that's just lots of good things right there. The Lord appears to him, says, fear not, for I am with you and will bless you and multiply your offspring. And then his response is he builds an altar and he calls upon the name of the Lord. Similar things to what Abraham was doing when he was living how he should be living. So I think that wraps up our Genesis. I didn't get as much time to really study and dive through the chapters, so sorry if that wasn't too engaging. But I did get a bit more time to go through Matthew, so hopefully I'll have more to draw out of that. First, our psalm and our proverb, though. So our psalm is, arise, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up because of the rage of my enemies. Rise up for me to the judgment you have commanded, so the congregation of the people shall surround you. For their sakes, therefore, return on high. The Lord shall judge the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to my integrity within me. Verses that really stand out to me are that last one. The Lord shall judge the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to my integrity within me. It's interesting asking the Lord to judge you. It seems contrary to Adam and Eve's response after they sin in the garden, and their response is to hide from God. Like they don't want God to judge them. Whereas this is saying, it's almost like a similar verse that I could think of where it's like, God, just know my heart, put a right spirit within me. And, God does know our hearts. We're not going to be hiding anything from him. And we want to be in alignment with him. And if we are doing something wrong, we want to be rebuked because we want to stay on that path. The last thing we want is to be going off of the path and then be trying to hide ourselves from God and to stay off of the path. If anything, we want to be corrected as quickly, as swiftly, and sometimes as painfully as we can in order to get our minds right again. Maybe our hearts right is the better way to put it. Now to our proverb. This is 3:9-10. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase. So your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. It's interesting. I'd imagine some of the prosperity gospel people probably like this one, where it says, if you give to the Lord first fruits of your increase, your possessions, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. They might interpret that as, oh, if you give to the church, then God will give you plenty. I think that's probably not the where our heart is supposed to be, though, when we're giving to God. It says, honor the Lord with your possessions. I think to truly honor the Lord, your heart has to truly be into the sacrifice you're making, not just as some transaction that you're making. Great way to put it is God's not a vending machine. It's not you put $1 in and you get a soda out. It's not, oh, you give to the church and then he's going to give you blessings back. Really, it just has to do with where your heart is. And God does give blessings to those who are in alignment with his will. It doesn't mean your life's not going to be incredibly difficult. If anything, it means your life most likely will be more difficult because God's going to use you in a way that you can help other people. And sometimes the best way to be able to help other people is if you've gone through those kind of problems or situations yourself. So God might be calling you to go through those first, so that on the back end, once you realize, oh, I turned to God, this is what I learned. Now there's these verses in the Bible that pop out to me that never really even made sense before because I didn't have the depth of character. And now that I understand this, all those people who are still dealing with the same problem, now I can go back to them and help them. And sometimes maybe just even more just on an individual basis. Sometimes that suffering just puts us in a position where we throw up our hands, we say, I can't do this. It makes us humble. And then we turn back to God, and that's kind of the position that he wants us in, but ultimately where we would want to be as well. Now let's get into Matthew 9:18-38. I believe there's some good ones here today. It's always good ones, though. So 9:18-38. I think we'll just read them all. Instead of me trying to jump around and figure out what's important, we'll just go through it, not translate it, but try to explain it, and then see what we might be able to draw from it. So there's the girl restored to life and a woman healed. This is verse 18, chapter 9 in Matthew. So while he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. So it says a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. I was reading, I believe, in R.C. Sproul, where he was saying this ruler was actually somebody who is high up in the Jewish structure or tradition at the time. So it's strange for him to be coming to Jesus for help, but it's most likely heard around town some of the miracles that Jesus has been doing, all the healings he's been doing, and he's just desperate at this point because his daughter has just died, but he has so much faith. He says, come and lay your hand on her and she will live. So at this point, Jesus hasn't brought anybody back from the dead yet, but he believes that Jesus can do this. And perhaps we already know what we're supposed to draw out of this story just based on those couple of verses. This is somebody high up in Jewish leadership who you might think is the last to believe in Jesus because his position is probably threatened by a lot of what Jesus stands for and a lot of what Jesus is saying. But he's brought into a humble position where he realizes his world is collapsed around him. And he realizes there's nothing that I can do. Like, I need God. And he's willing to believe in this moment that Jesus is God because it's really his only hope. And you might make the argument of, well, he's only believing in God so he can get something from him. But I think that's kind of a cynical way to think about it. I think the better way to think about it is sometimes God needs to break our spirit in order to make us ready to have a relationship with him, which is ultimately to our benefit. But we don't realize it's to our benefit until we're brought into that humble position where we're ready to throw our hands up, give up, and ask for help. And that seems to be what he's doing here. So Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. So Jesus hears this. He says, love your faith. Let's go bring this girl back from the dead. But behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. And I like what R.C. Sproul had to say about this. He says this woman is actually one of his favorite people in the entire gospel because, some people might try to make an appointment with Jesus, or they just barge in and say, like, hey, Jesus, like, I need you to heal. I need you to do something for me. And there's maybe a grain of entitlement there, perhaps. It could be desperation, but maybe a little entitlement where she's thinking, I've had this affliction for 12 years. I've spent all of my money trying to pay to doctors to try to fix this, and the thing just keeps getting worse. And I know this guy can heal me, but I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to get in the way of him healing anybody else. So I'll just touch his garment and then I'll be healed. That's all that needs to happen. So she not only has faith, but she's so humble that she doesn't even want to take any of Jesus's time. And the faith she has is pretty amazing because she just thinks if she could just touch his garment, that's all she's going to need. Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter. So he calls her daughter just like he previously had called one of the guys we were reading about son. I forget who it was. It might have been the paralytic, I think he called the son. Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. So that often happens with Jesus. Right when he says it, it immediately happens. There's no slow progress. It's his word is final. And when Jesus came and instantly the woman was made well, kind of what lost my train of thought is, I think some of the other gospels will go into a bit more detail here where she touches the garment and Jesus feels power come out of him. So he looks around and he's saying, who touched my garment? And then his apostles are like, you're in this giant crowd of people who are all over you and you're going to ask who touched you. And then the woman starts bawling. And she's saying, it was me, thinking that she's going to get rebuked. But then Jesus has complete compassion for her. And he says, your faith has made you well. And it's also, just to put this into context a little bit, the fact that she'd been bleeding for 12 years is a very big deal, not only for the health impacts, but also the spiritual impacts, because the Jewish tradition at this time would have viewed her as unclean, so she wouldn't have been able to engage in religious activities. And maybe that's part of what Jesus is pushing back against. He's here to help people like this woman who are afflicted, are suffering, are just at their wits' end, at their last hope. And he's here to help them instead of shunning them because he doesn't want to become unclean. So yeah, I'd certainly like the message that we can draw from that. And what's the way we can apply that? Is it reminds me of that verse of what you do for the least of them, you do for me. And it's that we shouldn't get some self-righteous position once we're Christians and think, oh, we're up here, we're not going to associate with anybody down there, they're just going to bring us down. We have to remember that we're only saved because God decided to save us. We should be incredibly grateful for that. And we don't know who of these people might also be predestined to be saved. I get into some controversy right there just saying that. But certainly was true in my case. I was not the one searching for God. He was the one reeling me in. But the idea there is you should treat everybody with compassion because people are going through some very hard things. And ultimately what they need is Jesus. They need God. And how wrong would it be for us if people did that for us, perhaps, and then we reaped the benefits of that because the Holy Spirit came into us, and then our faith grows, and now we have a relationship with God, and our entire life has changed. And for us not to want to spread that to as many people as possible. And sometimes it's the people who are hurting the most who could actually be the most receptive to that message, as Jesus shows in a lot of these different stories, both in this in the New Testament, but then also what we've been reading in the Old Testament, where sometimes people have to be just ready to give up, like Hagar, where her son is about to die in the wilderness, and then she cries, and then God comes and basically rescues both of them. That's this idea of humility, lowness, being ready for God after that. So keep in mind, Jesus is still on his way to go bring that one girl back from the dead. We've taken a detour as he heals Garment Girl. I probably shouldn't say that. And instantly the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute, so now Jesus is at the big Jewish guy's house, and Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion. And he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. So the reason there's flute players and crowd making a commotion is that's what was big in Jewish traditions, that nobody mourned alone. Even the poorest families would get some flute players, and then they'd have I think they called them like a wailing woman or something. So they have already started almost what sounds like a funeral service for this girl. And then Jesus comes in, he says, "She's not dead, she's sleeping," and they laugh at him. They mock him for saying that because to them, she is so clearly dead. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. So now we have a case of Jesus bringing someone back from the dead. And how does he do it? He just took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And other gospels might go into more detail there, but Matthew has a good tendency of being concise. So then Jesus heals 2 blind men, and as Jesus passed on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying aloud, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." Interesting, they ask for mercy, and also interesting, they call him the Son of David. When he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he took, so showing that faith does seem to be a prerequisite for a lot of these miracles, although we have also seen an example where that didn't seem to be the case. More times than not, though, seems like faith is what leads to being saved. Although, that's kind of interesting. And Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes, saying, "According to your faith, be it done to you." And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, "See that no one knows about it," but they went away and spread his fame through all that district. So the reason I pause there for a second is that faith is the precondition to like knowing Jesus. R.C. Sproul actually thinks it's the opposite way around, and I actually am kind of with R.C. Sproul on this, where he says that according to your faith be it done to you, and their eyes were opened. So in that, it seems like they have faith first, and then their eyes are opened. But this is talking about literally, like their eyes are open and then they see. What R.C. Sproul was saying is that spiritually, it might actually be the opposite. That when you try to read the Bible before you have the Holy Spirit, it might seem like interesting stories, but it's not speaking to your heart. It's not transforming you. And you just don't get it. At least that was certainly the case for me. Even when I'd gone to church for a couple weeks right before I became a Christian, and even when I was listening to some Christian music, it was almost like I was sleepwalking through it. Like it didn't feel like I was the one pursuing these things. And it didn't feel like I truly understood them. It seemed like a lot of words. Almost one of my cousins described going to church, and they're like, it's like they're speaking in a different language. And it almost is that way. Even though it's English, it doesn't register until you have the Holy Spirit. When you have the Holy Spirit and that moment happens, then afterward is where your faith starts to build. But how my buddy described this is it's almost all at the exact same moment, where it's called regeneration, justification, and then the beginning of your sanctification. Lots of $100 words right there. But this idea of regeneration is you're dead in your trespasses, as it says in Ephesians. You're 100% flesh. There's no part of you that even can have faith. Because if you're in the flesh, they say no good comes from the flesh. So your faith, which is good, can't come from your flesh. And if you're a fallen, there's no part of you that is searching for God. It certainly wasn't the case for me. And it doesn't seem that there could be. We can only run away from God or finally get to the point where we're willing to throw up our hands and at least stop fighting him. And then at that point, the Holy Spirit comes in, and then we start going towards God after that. I'm a new Christian, so, take what I say with a grain of salt, but that seems to be where I've landed on this as of right now. We'll see where I land on this in the future, but I don't think it's going to change just because from what I've read in the Bible, that seems to make a lot of sense. And then also from my own personal experience, it seems like I was not the one searching for God. It does feel like I had a moment of surrender, and I had faith in that exact moment and believed in God in that moment, received the Holy Spirit in that moment, and then afterwards everything changed. And it was like being dead and then becoming alive. And a dead person can't choose God. It's almost, he has to be made alive before or right at the exact moment when that happens. But probably tried to figure that out enough for this, and I'll dive more into that idea later. It's probably one of the most complex ones that we can think about, so I'm not going to solve it in a 45-minute live stream. And then that last part's kind of interesting. Jesus sternly warns them, don't tell anybody, but they went away and spread his fame through all the district. That's called the messianic secret. I always used to read that thinking, well, Jesus knows if he tells them not to tell people, it's just going to make them tell more people. So maybe that's part of his plan. But it could also be that he sternly warns them not to tell anybody. Now, it is interesting because since he's God, he knows that they're going to tell people. So it is interesting that he even bothers telling them not to. Put that aside for now. But another reason that he might do that is he knows he has a lot of work to do. He wants to be able to go around and heal people, but he doesn't want a giant mob probably everywhere he goes. He might be tired from all the healings that he just did. We've read about a lot of healings back to back to back. And it says that when that one lady touched his garment in the other gospels, it says power comes out of him. So God's power is unlimited, but perhaps because he's also a man, maybe that does get a bit exhausting. I know it certainly seems like it would be. Then the other aspect is a lot of the Jewish people at the time believed that the Messiah was going to lead a revolt against the Romans. So he also might want to be keeping that down a little bit too, because if too many people hear of things, they're going to start saying the Messiah's here, and then maybe it'll start leading to revolts, and maybe that's too much controversy. God, Jesus, still has a lot of preaching, teaching, and healing to do, and he wants things to, lie low a bit so that he can do more of that before things really start to pick up. And eventually they do pick up. So then we got one more little one before the one that I actually spent the most time reading today, where it says, man unable to speak, as they were going away, behold, a demon-oppressed man who is mute was brought to him. And when the demon had been cast out, the mute man spoke. And the crowds marveled, saying, never was anything like this seen in Israel. But the Pharisees said, he casts out demons by the prince of demons. So this is tying back to another idea that we've talked about over the last few days, where there's the structure that seems to have been built off of the Old Testament, Pharisees at the top of it, they're kind of self-righteous. They think they're clean, look down on the sinners at the bottom. And then Jesus is coming in and he is shifting everything that they believe is right. Jesus is saying, oh, you self-righteous people up at the top, you're actually the furthest away from the kingdom. And it's actually the sinners who are closer because they recognize that they need to be saved. They recognize that it's not their works that's going to get them into heaven, it's their faith. And they're much closer to faith because they're desperate for it. And they're not so wrapped up in believing that they're going to get, God's going to think they're good just because they follow his statutes better than everyone else. So the Pharisees see Jesus as a threat to their power and influence. So right here, Jesus does something amazing. He makes a man who's unable to speak be able to speak. He casts out a demon, and then the mute man speaks, and the crowd marvels, which is sometimes translated to, it's so amazing they're afraid. But the Pharisees say he casts out demons by the prince of demons. So they see this miracle happen, and their response is he's got a demon because he's the prince of the demons, instead of marveling like the rest of the crowd. So it just shows how hard their hearts are. Perhaps the lesson we draw from that is when we read about Jesus and his miracles, do we marvel at it? Do we view it as amazing and just view God as amazing? Or are we cynical about it? Do we have other explanations for what's going on? Cynical explanations, all sorts of different things. And then last one, we're now in Matthew 9, starting in 35. And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. Teaching, preaching, healing. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. So he sees the crowds and he has compassion for them. Then I love that imagery because that's exactly what I felt in that moment where I felt the Holy Spirit come into me. It was almost like I saw myself at my lowest moment, which was freshman year of college, just so lost, so afraid. And it was almost like I saw myself from God's perspective. And it was almost like I felt what God felt for just a fraction of a second. And it was enough of that fraction of a second to just crush me because it was such an overwhelming love and so much compassion, even though I was so lost and going in the wrong direction. It was almost just protective and just compassionate. That's the best word for it, that he cared about me and he was guiding me back to him slowly but surely. Maybe he didn't like to see me in the pain that I was in, but he knew that it was maybe what had to happen in order for me to eventually get back to him. So I love that Jesus has compassion for them because he sees that they need help. They're harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And love the imagery of sheep without a shepherd because sheep are dumb. They can't even look after themselves. They're like mindless. There's one video where a sheep is stuck in a pit and then they pull it out and he runs and then just jumps right back into the pit. And that seems to sum up the Christian journey there. We'll mess up and then God will bring us out of it. And then we just right back into our mess up again. Then he brings us out of it again. God probably just has his hand on his face, just like, these people, man. But that's why we need the shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." So he says to his disciples, harvest is plentiful. So he sees all these lost, helpless people, and he has compassion for them. And he says, this is the harvest. It is plentiful, but this is a lot of work for me to do. The laborers are few, and we need more people to teach, preach, and heal. So he's saying, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Notice he doesn't just say, the harvest is plentiful. You guys go out there, teach, preach, and heal. He eventually says that. But first he says, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest. And it reminds me of what we've seen with Abraham and now with Isaac, where before they go and do something, it seems like if they're doing it in their own power, they seem to mess things up. But the times where it says they build an altar and call upon the name of the Lord, that seems to be when they do things right. Jesus might be drawing a parallel here where he's saying, I need laborers. Last thing I need, though, is you guys going out and trying to do this on your own, trying to preach through your lens. No, I want you to pray to God first, call upon the name of the Lord, get your heart right, so then the Spirit can actually just speak through you instead of you relying on your own knowledge and understanding. So that's the pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest, to send out laborers, and then it's also into his harvest. So it's understanding as well that we can, plant seeds and try to water those seeds, but it's ultimately God who brings the increase. We can spread the gospel as much as we can. We can spread it as well as we possibly can. We could get master the art of persuasion and study every verse in the Bible and know the exact story to bring out based on some problem somebody's having in their life, and then share it perfectly with them. But just as we were talking about earlier, till the Holy Spirit is in you, not going to understand it. And it's ultimately God who has to break open that heart and crush that heart and make it so that person can even understand and be receptive to God. So that's why it's his harvest, not ours. And we should pray to him, because ultimately that's what's going to lead to people coming to Jesus. Doesn't mean that there isn't work for us to do. There's plenty of work for us to do. And Jesus is literally saying, I want to do this through you. But ultimately knowing that God is sovereign and that salvation comes through him and him alone.